The call came on a Sunday afternoon in October. I looked at the name on the screen, Diane Park, and for a moment I thought something had happened. Diane Park did not call me. She was the mother of my best friend. She knew who I was. She had made me lunch more times than I could count across the 11 years I had known her daughter. But she did not call me. She texted when there was a logistical question, and she waved when she saw my car in the driveway, and she had once sent me a card when my father was in the hospital that I had kept in the drawer of my desk for 3 years. She did not call. I answered. She said, "Nathan, are you somewhere you can talk?" I said, "Yes." She said, "I found Ellie in her room this afternoon. She was reading something on her phone, and she was crying. She heard me come in, and she put the phone down too fast, and she said she was fine, which she wasn't. And I saw enough to know she was reading your messages." I said nothing for a moment. She said, "I'm not calling to give you trouble. I'm calling because I've watched the two of you for 11 years, and I have some things to say. And I thought you should hear them before Ellie does something careful that she'll regret." I said, "What kind of things?" She said, "The kind a mother says when she's tired of watching two people be very intelligent about the wrong problem." She talked for 7 minutes. I listened to all of it. When she was done, I sat in my apartment for a long time looking at the wall, which was bare, because I had been meaning to hang something for 1.5 years and had not gotten around to it. Then I texted Ellie and asked if I could come over. "My name is Nathan Cole. I'm 33. I work in urban planning for the city. I think about how people move through space, which streets carry what weight, where a neighborhood needs room to breathe, and where it needs to be held together. I have been told that I am good at seeing systems. I have been told by Diane Park in a 7-minute phone call that I am very bad at seeing what is directly in front of me. Both assessments are accurate." Her name was Ellie Park. She was 32. She was a ceramicist. She made things that held other things, bowls and vessels and forms that existed at the place where useful and beautiful stopped being different. She had a studio in the back of the house on Maple Street, where she had grown up, which she had moved back into 2 years ago after the lease on her apartment in the city ended, and the city felt, as she had told me at the time, like it was asking too much. I had helped her move. I had driven 4 trips in the car and carried the boxes and assembled the shelving in the studio, and had told myself, as I drove back alone, that this was what you did for someone you cared about, and that the weight in my chest on the drive home was simply tiredness from the moving. She had a habit of leaving clay on her hands longer than she meant to, not dirty exactly, just the gray trace of work that said she'd been making something. She had a small scar on her left thumb from a kiln accident in her 20s that she never mentioned unless someone else noticed it first. She had a laugh that built slowly, and then arrived completely, the kind that required the room's full attention once it was present. She had a way of listening that made the thing you were saying feel like it was worth the words. We had been best friends since we were 22. We met at a city planning public forum. She had come because the forum concerned a neighborhood where her studio space was at the time. I had come because it was my job. And she had said something in the open comment period that reframed the central question in a way I hadn't considered, and I had spoken to her afterward, and we had been talking ever since. For 11 years, nearly every day in some form. The kind of friendship that becomes the fixed point, the one you navigate from. I want to be honest about what 2 years of managed feelings looks like from the inside. It looks like normal. You have the friendship, which is real and good and carries its own genuine weight. And you have the other thing running underneath it, which you have learned to treat as ambient. You notice when she texts first in the morning, without making anything of it. You notice the particular quality of her attention when she is listening to you specifically, as opposed to listening generally, without naming why you notice. You volunteer for things, helping with the move, driving to the kiln supplier at 7 in the morning because the delivery didn't arrive and she had a gallery deadline, without examining what motivates the volunteering. There had been an evening in January when she had been having the kind of bad week that had no specific cause, just the accumulated weight of things not going quite right, and she had called me at 9 o'clock and said, "I'm not going to tell you I'm fine." I said, "Good." She said, "Can I just talk for a while?" I said, "Yes." She talked for an hour and 20 minutes. I listened to most of it from the kitchen floor, because I had sat down at some point and not gotten back up, and I thought, somewhere in the 53rd minute, I would do this every night for the rest of my life, without finding it difficult. I had filed that thought under, "I am a good friend." This was partially true and significantly incomplete. I am, professionally, someone who identifies where systems are carrying weight they were not designed to carry. It had taken me 2 years to apply that skill to myself. This is not a compliment to my self-awareness. There had been a May afternoon when she had sent me a photograph from the studio. A piece that had cracked in the kiln, perfectly along the line she had been most uncertain about when she was making it, and the message had said only, "It knew." I had looked at that photograph for a long time. Not at the crack, at the way she had thought to send it to me. She had made something and it had broken in the exact place she had feared, and her first impulse was to show me. I had thought about that impulse for 3 days. I had not examined why I found it significant. There had been the conversation in August, 3 weeks before the Friday texts, when she had said, "Do you ever think we would have been good together, in another life?" She had said it lightly, the way you say a hypothetical. I had said, "What do you mean by another life?" She had said, "I don't know." Never mind. We had moved on. I had not moved on. I had been replaying the question at intervals ever since and had never answered it, not even to myself, because the answer was not a hypothetical and I had not been ready to know that. Then the Friday texts. Then the Sunday call. We texted constantly. It was the primary medium of our friendship, not calls, not plans made in advance, but the ongoing low-frequency transmission of the day. She would send me photographs of clay forms that hadn't worked out, not for advice, just to share the wreckage. I would send her screenshots of planning documents that had absurdist qualities she would appreciate. She sent voice notes when she was in the studio and her hands were occupied. I sent long texts late at night when I was thinking through something, and she was the person I thought through things with. The texts she had been reading on the Sunday in October were from the Friday night. I had been in a bad week, a proposal that had failed at the committee level, the specific exhaustion of work that means something to you not landing. And I had texted her from the couch at 10:30, which was a habit, and I had said more than I usually said. I had said, "I think about you more than I tell you." That the day is better when there's something in it from you. That I have been aware for a while that what I'd lose if you weren't around would be the most significant loss I can imagine. And that's a strange thing to know about a person you've never told. I had sent it and immediately sent another text that said, "Ignore that. It's a long week. Good night." She had said, "Good night." She had not said, "Ignore that." I had spent Saturday telling myself she was being kind. I had spent Sunday hearing from her mother. Diane Park said, and I am going to try to be accurate about this, she said, "I have watched Ellie for 11 years try to figure out what you are to each other. I have watched her be careful with you in the way you are careful with things you don't want to break. I have watched her date people who were good and not right. And I have sat in this kitchen and known the reason and said nothing, because it was not my place. But I am telling you now, as plainly as I can, that my daughter was crying over your texts not because she was sad. She was crying because you finally said something true, and it was more than she knew what to do with in a Friday night. She said, "I don't know what you've been telling yourself, but I know what I've been watching, and the watching is done. So whatever you do next, do it on purpose." I texted Ellie. I asked if I could come over. She said, "Yes." She said, "When?" I said, "Now, if that's okay." She said, "It's okay." The drive to Maple Street was 22 minutes. I had driven it hundreds of times. I had driven it in summer and in winter, in the early morning and late at night, for dinner and for bad news, and for nothing in particular. I knew every turn. I knew the light that always caught red at the Clement intersection, and the stretch of elm trees that went yellow first in October, and the driveway with the slight dip on the left side that you had to remember to account for. I had never driven it knowing that what I was going to say when I got there would change what the drive meant from that point forward. Diane opened the door. She looked at me with the expression of a woman who had done a thing she believed was right and was now watching to see if she had judged correctly. She said nothing. She stepped aside. Ellie was in the kitchen. She was at the counter with a cup of tea she wasn't drinking, and she had clay on her left hand from the studio, the gray trace of work. And she looked at me when I came in with the expression of someone who has been found out and is deciding whether to be afraid of it. I said, "Your mother called me." She said, "I know. She told me she was going to." I said, "You knew?" She said, "I found out about 45 minutes ago." She gave me a warning, which was generous. I said, "Were you crying over the texts?" She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the tea. She said, "Yes." I said, "Because you were sad." She said, "Because you said something true that I didn't know how to respond to. Because She stopped. She said, "I've been careful with you for 11 years. And then you sent that text and then you said ignore it and I couldn't." I said, "I shouldn't have said ignore it." She said, "No, you shouldn't have." I sat down at the kitchen table, the one I had sat at more times than I could count, under the light that Diane always kept low in the evening, because she said overhead light was unkind. The kitchen smelled like whatever Diane had been baking, and the faint mineral smell of the studio that always came through when the door was open. Ellie sat down across from me. She still had the tea. I said, "I meant it. The things I said in the text." She said, "Which part?" I said, "All of it." I said, "I've been thinking about you in the way that doesn't have a clean category for as long as I can remember, and I have been telling myself it was friendship. Which it is, but it's also more than that. And I've been calling it the wrong name for a long time." She held her cup. She said, "Why didn't you say so?" I said, "Because you are the fixed point, the thing I navigate from." And I was afraid that saying the true thing would move the point, and then I wouldn't know where I was. She was quiet for a long moment. The house settled around us, that particular sound of an old house at rest. She said, "Nathan, I rearranged 2 days of studio work the week you had the committee failure, because I could tell from your texts that you needed someone to appear in person, and I wanted to be that person. I drove 40 minutes to show up with food I made at 11 in the morning, and I told you I was in the neighborhood." I said, "You told me you were in the neighborhood." She said, "I was not in the neighborhood. I was in my studio when you texted at 9 and I drove here specifically." Something in my chest settled and shifted at the same time. She said, "I have been careful with you because you are the fixed point for me too. And I was afraid of the same thing, I said, "We've been afraid of the same thing." She said, "Yes." I said, "That seems like something we should have said sooner." She said, "Yes." She looked at the tea. She said, "Your text on Friday said the day is better when there's something in it from you." I've thought about that sentence since Friday night. I've thought about it in the studio and while I was trying to sleep and in the shower this morning. I couldn't answer it because every answer I had was more than a text. I said, "What's the answer?" She looked at me. The kitchen was quiet and amber, and her hands were around the cup, and she had clay on one thumb from the morning, and 11 years of knowing each other was in the room with us, taking up the particular space that long things take up. She said, "The day is better when there's something in it from you, too." She said, "Every day. For a long time." I just didn't know what to do with knowing it. I said, "I know what to do with it." She said, "What?" I reached across the table. I put my hand over hers, the one with the clay on it. She looked at it. She looked at me. She didn't move away. I said, "Tell me the answer that was more than a text." She did. It took a while. I listened to all of it. Diane came in at some point with more tea that neither of us had asked for, set it on the counter, and left without saying anything. She was, and I say this with complete sincerity, the best timed entrance I have ever witnessed. 6 months later, I hung something on the bare wall in my apartment. It was a bowl Ellie had made, small, gray-blue, the glaze on the rim going amber at the edge where the heat had been highest. She gave it to me for no occasion and said, "You needed something on that wall." I said, "I've been meaning to sort that." She said, "I know. That's why I made you something." A year after the phone call, when people asked how it started, I said, her mother called me on a Sunday afternoon and said 7 sentences that I did not have an answer for. They always laughed about the mother. Ellie always said, "She gave me 45 minutes warning, which is the most diplomatic thing anyone has ever done in this family." Diane, when asked, always said, "I simply made a phone call." She said it with the expression of a woman who knew she had done something significant and was choosing to describe it as ordinary. She had. It was. Nothing had been buried. It had simply been standing at the wrong angle to the light for 11 years, and it had taken one Sunday phone call from a mother who had been watching longer than either of us to turn it around and show us what it was. What would you have done if the mother of your best friend called to tell you her daughter had been crying over your texts? And have you ever been afraid of saying the true thing because the person it was about was the fixed point, the one you couldn't afford to move? Tell me in the comments. If this one stayed with you, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.